Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. This is episode 1 of 2 with Laura Dombi from DNV, where we talk about the role of audit within sustainable procurement. And I'm delighted to introduce Laura Dombi from DNV. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Shaun. Thank you so much for having me on board today.
No, thanks very much for joining us. Laura, would you like to firstly talk a bit about yourself, your background, how you became involved in sustainability?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Laura. I'm a principal consultant at DNV. I'm an assurance and ESG auditor, an expert in supply chain sustainability and responsible sourcing and procurement, and have spent the past 8 years mainly in metals and mining, as well as other kind of hard to abate sectors, to help them understand, where are these hotspots from an environmental and social point of view? Where do they need to focus on in the value chain? Where those risks and opportunities arise? And as an independent auditor and assurance provider, I really love kind of bringing in these independent views and really challenging organizations on the status quo and how they are approaching responsible sourcing and how they think about it.
So, Laura, who's your client? Who are these reports for?
Sure. So our key clients are either kind of FTSE 100 clients, big corporations, and the reason why they come to us is basically they're saying, well, look, our investors, our stakeholders, our customers are asking us, more and more difficult questions around how our products are produced, where these are produced, and what are the key ESG characteristics of these products. So when we think about environmental protection, or we think about human rights or social compliance, clients and investors really want to know the full story behind the products that the clients are producing. So this is where we come in and we conduct an independent review, either of the whole supply chain or certain pockets of the supply chain, to understand, where these material risks are. And we provide an independent opinion to the client. So usually this goes up to the board of directors, where they see, okay, in this assurance engagement, these are the key risks and opportunities that we identified, or also those risks where perhaps they have less well-defined controls, and those could, if things are not managed well, they could go wrong. So they need to pay attention.
So you've mentioned a couple of sectors. The sort of mining, particularly the mining sector, is very challenging and has its issues. What sort of challenges are you seeing in those sectors in particular?
Sure. I think so far what we've seen in kind of commodity sectors is much more kind of just a social, license to operate issues, or ESG was more of a kind of tick box exercise to make sure that local communities on board. So there's no issues in terms of getting the materials in and out of the location, or the local authorities are giving these license to operate and permits, so that the kind of pollution aspects are covered by the company. And I think what we see more and more is that actually the way how mining companies operate and how they integrate ESG aspects into their whole operations will really drive value for them. So when you think about kind of the mining of the future, circular economy, for instance, why do we need to still keep digging things out of the ground when actually that there could be more circular options to drive that kind of brand value, or that bottom line. So I think that's really interesting in terms of how mining industry especially is redefining its role within the industries where they operate. So they don't only see ESG as a kind of box ticking exercise, but it's something that is really core to their purpose, to their operations. And that is something that I think is quite kind of narrative change over the past few years.
And do you see different trends in different parts of the world?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think, with regards to ESG, some of your listeners will be well aware of the myriad of EU regulations that are coming our way. So whether it's the Corporate Sustainability Directive, so CSRD, or ESRS, or Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, if we are very specific in procurement, similar regulations are coming in the US, in Australia as well. However, what we see that obviously in some parts of, especially in least developed countries, there is still this gap between the kind of local standards and local law versus what these international good practices and benchmarks are requiring of mining companies in particular, for instance, in the supply chain.
Is there a risk? I mean, you've mentioned lots of different legislation that's going down the tube, and we could spend a lot of time talking about any of those. Is there a trend then potentially for procurers to divert their money, their funds to less regulated parts of the world? Because clearly, as you said, particularly in the EU, it's becoming more and more and more regulated. Is there a danger that we end up with a race to the bottom and a race to the least regulated parts of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a risk. However, I think what these legislations are trying to do is exactly avoid that. So it is on the kind of on the manufacturer's responsibility to ensure that they are putting these due diligence practices in motion, and that they understand what are those potential forced labor risk or social risk or environmental risk. And really interesting with CSDDD is that we're not only looking at social compliance and human rights assessments, but it's also bringing in the environmental protection, which is, usually was disintegrated in the past few years when companies looked into due diligence. So I think that there is that, reporting obligation and that drive to provide more transparency of, where manufacturers in the EU are seeing these risks. Where are those hidden pockets of the supply chain where perhaps they haven't done enough in the past, and they have substantial risk. And really interesting, if you check the wording of CSDDD, for instance, they're actually saying that responsible disengagement should be used as a last resort. So the whole aim of these new regulations coming in is to encourage that capacity building effort. If you look into things like decarbonization and the carbon border adjusted mechanism, or CBAM, what we see there as well is more of a capacity building part in the next 2 years, where big brands, they need to work now with their suppliers. So if you think about aluminium or steel, they need to be working with their suppliers of metal to understand where these metals are produced, what is the origin, and then work with them to calculate the greenhouse gas impacts. So what I see as well in many of these regulations is that actually supply chain capacity building is coming into the forefront, rather than just the companies are pushing these requirements down to the bottom. There is much more responsibility and accountability that these brands need to make and take when they are operating in the EU, for instance.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you mentioned steel and aluminium, because I was going to come to that. There's a lot of talk now, of course, about net zero and decarbonising everything, and obviously the metals industry is very carbon intensive. How are you seeing the efforts to decarbonise products like steel and aluminium? Is it really possible, and is it really happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a lot of stakeholder engagement in this. So if you see the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative or Responsible Steel, these are all forums, multi-stakeholder forums where, sometimes for the first time, industry leaders, NGOs, customers, investors, banks are all coming together to define the right way for the industry to go about it. And obviously you think about lots of complexities that come with decarbonizing such complex industries. So I think that's really positive that, these talks are happening. I also, believe that some of these are still very Europe or US focused. So that, there should be much more focus on making sure that the stakeholders at the table are as diverse as possible and are representative of the markets that they represent. I think that is an issue that is very much EU and US led. And I think accounting has been, it's a great job for us accountants or insurance providers, because, there is endless discussions we could have on methodologies and what to include, and, how we actually create a level playing field when, primary steel production is so different to a secondary steel production route, and, how you create a level playing field so that, you're working towards the same definitions. What I see here is all of these things need to be very market oriented and market focused from the outset. So it's not just about how the organizations will invest and work with banks to enable the climate transition, but it's, at that moment, we're already talking about how to market these. So, if you are a customer who's buying primary steel or primary aluminium, how can you account for those savings, for those investments in your own scope 3 emissions? And what is that market mechanism that will drive companies to decarbonize? And I think that is the most important question that is currently happening on the markets. And our role as assurance providers is to bring some credibility to that process in terms of accounting as much as we can.
So that's kind of going up and down the value chain, isn't it? It's up the value chain to the client, and then obviously, all the way down the value chain through the supply chain. Certainly, one of the challenges that I see working with clients is this whole issue of transparency down to the lower tiers of the supply chain, and that seems to be a bigger challenge for some sectors than others. I do a lot of work in construction, and it's a massive challenge for construction. Whereas I think other industries like automotive have maybe got a pretty good handle on where all their stuff comes from. How do you see those challenges? Because there seem to be a lot of commercial barriers. Immediately you go one step down the supply chain, everybody screams commercial confidentiality at you, and I'm not going to tell you who my supplier is because you want to cut me out and you want to go straight to that supplier. All of that kind of noise gets generated. Are you seeing organizations being successful in circumnavigating that challenge?
Yeah, thanks for I love this question, because this is what I spent the last, 8 years of my career doing. And maybe I'll tell you a story of actually one of the first projects that I've been involved in. It's an aluminium one, and that was exactly the question. We worked with packaging client who used aluminium foil for their packaging, and they wanted to know, where do these, aluminium coils come from? Where are they produced? And, what is the whole journey of the product from, mining of bauxite, which is the raw material for aluminium, all the way through smelting and refining, etc. So, and they only knew their tier 1 supplier, so they know, where they get the aluminium inputs, but they had no idea kind of, further down what we will find in the supply chain. And it was really interesting, a couple of months actually. And what I learned through that process, we looked into the Chinese supply chain and then the European and Brazilian supply chains. And I think that the importance of tier 1 suppliers as ambassadors throughout this journey, and helping them understand, what is the market benefit of actually engaging in these conversations. Am I going to get a premium after this? Am I going to get a special license to trade? Am I going to get a positive star on securing more supply over the long run? And I think it was so important that we worked very closely with the procurement organization here, and we did site visits. I went to China. I went to the Spanish refinery operations as well. I think we really demonstrated through the exercise that, hey, you're not here to kind of do a pass or fail audit. It's not kind of box ticking exercise, but we are really here to help you understand what are these upcoming expectations, customer expectations that you will need to meet over the next few years, and where you already have the existing systems to perform to these expectations, and where your key gaps are. And I think when you use this language instead of a pass or fail, that really helped us engage at that kind of first tier level. And then once they were on board, the first tier, then going to the second tier and the third tier was much easier, because they acted as the ambassadors, as the local ambassadors for us going into the smelter. And actually I went into, I think, parts of China as well, where we went to the mine, a publicly owned company. Really, really interesting. We were actually told to go and have a siesta in the middle of the day, and we were only allowed to go to see the museum, not to the actual mines. But even the fact that they welcomed us, and there was kind of that openness for a site visit, even if obviously the audit conditions weren't there, so we couldn't really verify health and safety data, or we couldn't verify community engagement. This gives just so much information to our end client in terms of what is really happening in their supply chains, and doing this engagement. It wasn't easy, I would say, but it definitely was a journey that if you think a couple of years down the line now, many of their supply chain actors are in fact ASI certified, and the mines where couldn't quite meet these requirements, the tier 2 are now incentivized to source from other parts of the country, or from other sources that are meeting these ESG expectations.
It's interesting you sort of telling the story from China about what you were allowed to see and not allowed to see. Clearly, there's lots of anecdotal stories about auditors or attempts to deceive auditors, shall we say, and in various countries around the world. I won't just pick on China, because obviously that's a kind of obvious thing to do. But I mean, certainly, if I go way back in my career in the oil and gas sector, there were tales of factories that were being set up in certain countries just to send the auditor to. So basically, you could hire a factory by the day. They put your logo up on the factory with the nice, clean conditions and nice, clean, happy workers. And the auditor goes around and looks at that factory and says, yeah, that's a lovely factory. And then the next day it's somebody else's factory, because it's not where your stuff is being made at all. There seems to be some quite sophisticated ways. I think if enough ingenuity was gone into getting around the audits as it was to actually doing the job properly in the first place, the world would be a better place. How do you see that? Do you see those sort of attempts at deception, and how do you deal with them?
Yeah, I think that's also a great question, and I think it is a challenge for supply chain due diligence, right? So if you're looking into things like SEDEX, Meta, social audits, there will be many different companies doing these. I mean, quite a commoditized market, and once you get to that global level, obviously maintaining that quality for $300 a day, like it really becomes quite challenging, right? In terms of how do you make sure you have the competent auditors who are able to obviously see through these issues, and where it just becomes a box ticking exercise. And I think that's something that the social auditing space is grappling with at the moment. There is very different levels of quality in the work in certain parts of the world, or certain markets as well. And again, there's also this kind of race to the bottom as you mentioned, for the auditing firms as well. So I think again it comes back to how do we add value, and what is the objective of the brand or at the end client, right? Like, is it just to kind of tick a box, or are they actually using this as a core risk mitigation method that is looking to their full ISO 2400 management system, and how they drive value and what it means for their strategy. Because I think audits are probably just one way of mitigating your risks, but you need to look into various tools that are available to you to really understand where these key supply chain risks are. And I agree, if you spend 1 or 2 days at a site, it's almost impossible to get to the bottom of some of these risks. So I think brands need to be, and clients need to be much more strategic in terms of how they think about their overall supply chain due diligence, their overall risk assessment, and making sure that it is data driven, monitoring the supply chain, not just through periodic audits, but through also other means of collecting. For instance, we are working a lot with digital solutions like workers' voice, like new technologies in terms of satellite imaging, where in those areas where we are not able to go. And working with companies like DMV, we do advise on risk. So we're going to tell you that, look, there are regions in the world where we aren't allowed to go because the auditor will likely be arrested at the airport. That those are unfortunately life situations that we are dealing with. So we do not advise to carry out an independent audit because the conditions are not there, right? So if I'm not allowed to speak to workers, if I don't have access to the site, if I don't have access to documentation that I need to review and these documentations are not provided in good faith, then your audit outcome, you can't trust the audit outcome. So I think that is also really important, that we are very open with our clients. Look, there are parts of the supply chain that you can get assurable outcomes, and there are those parts of the supply chain, because of the inherent risk, you aren't able, and you need to have other desk-based methods, as I said, satellite imaging or other methods to assess your supply chain risks.
Thanks, Laura, for episode 1 of 2, talking about the role of audit within supply chain. We look forward to the second episode, where we'll talk about wider supply chain management issues.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.